Welcome to the Emerging Biotech Leader, where we help biotech leaders maximize the value of their therapeutics from translational development to product launch. We're your hosts. I'm Kim Kushner.
And I'm Ramin Farhad. We are here to help you navigate the pitfalls of the biotech industry and illuminate the path forward.
Welcome to today's episode of the Emerging Biotech Leader. I'm so glad to welcome Dr. Samir Ounzain from HAYA Therapeutics. We're going to have a really great discussion today. We're going to hit topics around the scientific founder as a leader in the organization, what that means in terms of organizational growth. HAYA is doing some really innovative things in terms of preventative medicine and really thinking about changing their philosophy about how they build the company just as much as how they think about the science and changing the biology of the human body. The last area we're going to dig into a bit is really about how to change our healthcare system to think about prevention as key, not just treating things after the fact. So very excited for today's conversation. Samir, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you for the invitation and really excited for this conversation.
Same here. Maybe to jump right into our first topic, but more importantly, a little bit about your background. You are the quintessential scientific founder. You've been building the company, but you've been here since the beginning of even the concept behind HAYA. So do you mind just giving a little bit of your personal background and how it's led you to where you are today?
Sure. So yes, I'm what you would call a scientific founder. Founder-led movement, I guess, is one of the themes that is emerging in this space. So HAYA is essentially based on my scientific curiosity and my scientific academic career. So prior to founding HAYA, I spent almost 15 years as an academic basic scientist, specifically in the area of regulatory genomics and genome biology. So from a very early age, actually, I had quite a strong interest in trying to understand why are humans different to our neighboring members of the animal kingdom? What makes us unique? What makes us special in certain senses? And that fundamental question really led me to my scientific interest, which is how does the genome speak to the environment? And how does that ability of the genome to adapt and speak to the environment in somewhat of an anti-fragile way allow us to develop, allows us to evolve, allows us to create these emergent properties of our biology, like culture, like music, like intelligence. But ultimately, it really started to provide an insight into allowing us to understand how are we susceptible and how do we develop common and chronic diseases. And that thread of the biology from curiosity to ultimately translation is really what led me as an academic with the work I was doing to start thinking about transitioning outside of the academic world and taking this biology that we've been working on and unlocking ultimately into the clinic and potentially bring benefit to patients, especially those with common and chronic diseases.
Amazing. I love how you tell that story, not just about your own trajectory, but also what you're trying to do differently in the company, how you're tying biology and culture together. There's so many aspects of just being human that you're thinking about in terms of the design of your organization and what you're really trying to solve for. But your background is fairly unique in that you've had a very successful run moving from academia into being a founder-led company. And in some organizations, that's considered an asset. In other circumstances, it's considered, a risk or an issue for an organization during its early scale. So can you talk about your own experience making that transition? What's differentiated you? And more importantly, how has that become a strength for HAYA versus a risk that we see in other places?
Yeah. So I think, first of all, there's an aspect of the beginner's mindset and really trying to understand the problem you're trying to solve. So when myself, and I should also really mention my co-founder, I think it's really a critical, let's say, transition to move from academia into industry, but to do that with a co-founder is really, really important. And my co-founder and I, Daniel Blessing, who is my co-founder, one of the key things we invested a lot of time and energy in as we were thinking about founding HAYA to translate this biology was what does it actually mean operationally? What are the skills and what is the mindset shift that needs to be different? Now, as an academic, you spend a lot of your time focused on the curiosity, the discovery, and it's very much an open-ended, somewhat solo enterprise. Whereas as you're transitioning into building an organization to potentially translate biology into a product, into a real-world solution for a real-world problem, there are very, very different skills and really mindsets required. And I think central to that was the early understanding that really organizationally, you have a clearly defined problem, you're trying to develop a product against that problem, and you have a relatively well-defined amount of time and resource to execute on that. So you really think and frame what is the time and resource constraints to deliver on that problem. Whereas in academia, you're focused more in an open-ended way in trying to just satisfy your curiosity and make discovery. And as the CEO, I realized very, very quickly that I essentially had 3 objectives to deliver on that, which was setting the, let's say, the North Star for the vision and the strategy to deliver on that problem solving, which in our case is truly tractable disease-modifying medicines for common and chronic disease. That's our North Star. How are we going to have a high impact on field function and survival outcomes in patients with common and chronic disease in a tractable way? And that was anchored on the biology that we've been unlocking, this biology around the regulatory genome, this causal biology around cell state. So that's the vision. But how do you actually get there? Well, you need a highly multidisciplinary and effective team to deliver on that mission and vision. And ultimately, you need the resources to enable that team to deliver on that vision and mission. And actually, as the scientific founder and as the CEO, my job is more of a facilitator and an enabler than an executor. And so really that was the mindset shift, focusing on how do we build an organization, how do we find the right talent, and how do we enable that talent with resource, focus, and direction to deliver on ultimately what is our vision, which is, we like to joke internally, but it's actually not a joke, which is we want to bring some sanity to drug discovery and drug development in common and chronic disease. And by sanity, we anchor that to the principles that we develop medicines for, which is developing causal medicines that are safe, accessible, needed, and effective. So sane medicines. And that's essentially the, let's say, the more holistic framing that me and my co-founder had from very, very early on in terms of what do we need to actually build and deliver to reach that goal and that ambition.
Such an amazing overview. And you pull on a number of threads here that I want to come back to. The team that you need to build, highly multidisciplinary. I think there's an element of humility in knowing what you know and what you don't know, and the team that you have to bring together in order to execute and deliver successfully is a huge step, especially coming out of academia, where you do have a little bit more of kind of a limited purview. You're focused, your head's down, and you are the execution team just as much as you're the visionary. And so being able to execute through others and influence through others towards an outcome that you know is incredibly important is a huge skill that you've clearly had to build and get comfortable with over the years. I think that other point that really stood out to me is that you need to be clearly solving a problem. And that to me is the exact point when it comes to the issue of scientific founders. We often find people are stuck in academia. They're caught in their curiosity. They're solving really interesting scientific research questions, and that could be endless, but it's not solving a specific problem that turns an idea into an asset, into something that becomes a therapy for patients. So can we dig into that for another moment? I want to hear a little bit more about how did you get there? What was it for you that made that point?
So I got there kind of back to front in a way, but ultimately the way I got there, I think also anchors on how we think about translation and creating innovative approaches for these common and chronic diseases. So we very much approach this building backwards from the causal translational biology that directly impacts field function and survival outcomes in patients. So we take in somewhat a first principles approach, which is, let's take our lead indication space more broadly of heart failure. What are we actually trying to solve in heart failure? Okay? Well, the FDA cares a lot about people feeling better even before functioning better. So feel and function, okay? And ultimately, survival, outcomes linked to morbidity and mortality. So if you just take a very simple first principles approach in heart failure, and you can apply this actually to most common and chronic diseases and build backwards and say, what is the causal process that impacts a person's ability to function, that organ function well, influences how they feel, and ultimately sets the probability of hard outcomes, of survival outcomes. Right. If you just build backwards from the pathophysiology of the patient, something becomes very, very clear very fast, which is at a causal level, it's not pathways or genes, it's not a linear process of broken parts, it's actually a nonlinear process of cellular states influencing tissue homeostasis and function. So just taking a very first principles approach, building back from the unmet patient need, it becomes very clear the layer at which you need to make tractable for high effect size impact in field function and survival outcomes in these patients, it's cellular states and tissue architecture and homeostasis. So that's essentially how we frame everything, which is take a first principles approach to identify the layer, the tractable layer of causality that is actually going to impact field function and survival. And then when you do that, then the next question is, but how can you actually intervene and develop a medicine to target that layer of causality? Well, that's where then we follow the biology. So we build backwards from the field function and survive, let's say, outcomes and pathophysiology. And then we build forwards in terms of our drug discovery and development process, anchoring that on biological causality. And so when you meet in the middle, what we realized relatively fast was, well, it's actually cellular states, which are an emergent property of the activity of your genome, rather than a linear process of proteins or pathways that are causal for these field function and survival outcomes in most common chronic disease. We keep following the biology and we realize that that biology is transacted by the regulatory genome, which is the 98% of the genome that doesn't code for protein, which is the information processing operating layer. And then we take it a step forward and say, well, is that layer of biology tractable to drug discovery and drug development? Well, yes, it turns out that that operating layer of biology uses RNA to transact that biology. And RNA can be targeted using genetic medicines. So when you pull those threads together and build backwards from the patient need and forwards from tractable causal biology, we come up with a solution, which could actually be a product that will be safe, accessible, needed, and because of the layer of causality that we're able to target, effective in common and chronic disease. So that's our thinking and how we build any program.
You have not lost your scientific edge whatsoever. It's clearly core, which I very much appreciate. And as you think about the company, can you tell me how big is HAYA at this point in terms of number of employees?
So full-time employees now, we're around 60 people. 60
okay.
Employees.
60 employees going after one of the larger indications in the market, which many would also say is an incredibly unique path and wildly difficult when you're thinking about who else is playing in the heart failure space. I know the entire core of what HAYA is doing is going after chronic common conditions, but what makes you decide to start with something like heart failure that is such a big nut to crack?
So again, we're building backwards from the causal biology. And in the case of heart failure, it's becoming very apparent that diastolic dysfunction in particular, which is the poor relaxation of the heart, which really underpins half of all heart failure. The technical term for your audience is heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. This is a syndrome associated with remodeling of the interstitial domain of the heart, not the functioning contractile domain, right. The cardiomyocytes, where most actually precision cardiology therapies are targeted. It's the interstitial space, it's the stromal compartment, which is all about structure, organization, and signaling, okay? And typically, that role is anchored by what we call sentinel cells, so a specific type of cells that act as command and control cells within the extracellular space. And these cells are called fibroblasts. they also command and control the inflammatory response in
Right.
this fibroinflammatory axis. They also command and control the functional cells, the metabolism or the energetics of the functional cells, for example, the cardiomyocytes. So why is this important? Because we know that these fibroblasts and their ability to drive fibrosis and this whole kind of sequelae of mechanisms linked to their behavior is a core driver of remodeling in the heart, diastolic dysfunction, fetal function, and survival outcomes more broadly. But the industry has unfortunately not been able to develop many what you would call antifibrotic agents, molecules that are able to block fibrosis. And part of the reason is that all these proteins and pathways that control fibrosis, like proteins as a class, are very pleiotropic, okay? So proteins are basically doing errands for the genome, and they're not very specific in where they're active. Which means that when you try to develop drugs to target them, you typically suffer with exaggerated pharmacology in places which you don't want to touch. And this is exactly the challenge in fibrosis, is that most antifibrotics that have been in development typically fail in phase 1 or 2 because of a small therapeutic window, because of exaggerated pharmacology, when you're trying to target TGF-beta signaling, etc. Whereas the regulatory genome, HAYA's biological target space, allows us to precisely control the effector cells of fibrosis, fibroblasts, just in the tissue, context, and disease that we care about, in this case, the heart.
Right.
So this actually provides us now with a paradigm to go after relatively large indications where the causal biology is anchored on a very important process like fibrosis through these cellular reprogramming in an RNA-guided fashion of these effector cells, in this case, fibroblasts within the heart.
So it's fundamentally the difference in mechanism and what you're building that gives you the confidence to be able to go after a large indication against some of the largest pharmaceutical companies and budgets out there, because you know you're treating something just drastically differently than anything else that's out there. That's
our thesis, which is we follow the biology, and internally we have this concept around what I call the Procrustean bed of biopharma, which, if for those in the audience who are familiar with the bed of Procrustes, the myth of the innkeeper who, whenever somebody would pass through his inn, he would offer them a bed, but there was a problem or a challenge that if you accepted the bed, you were meant to fit perfectly to the bed, which means you were either stretched out or chopped so you fit perfectly in the bed. And in many ways, the way we are trying to think about treating common and chronic diseases is falling into this Procrustean trap, which is we are trying to fit causal human biology into the tools and the conceptual framework of thinking around drug discovery and drug development, which is that drug discovery and drug development is linear, it's protein-centric, and it's pathway-dependent. Protein A regulates protein B, controls pathway C, which causes disease. When actually common and chronic disease is happening at a higher level of causality, at the level of cellular states, tissue architecture, and tissue function, which in many ways is nonlinear in terms of how you think about it. So that gives us the conviction to take this causal biology or biology native approach to innovating in the common and chronic disease space.
That's amazing. One of the things that really stands out to me in this conversation, but prior conversations you and I have had as well, is that you really have taken on that mindset shift away from the academic, just trying to solve a specific problem, but also very much in terms of your learning approach and what you are recognizing, the questions you have to ask, the people you have to bring around the table. And I think you've mentioned to me in the past that you don't love the idea of strong convictions, that they get you in trouble more than anything. So talk to me about that and how it's shifted your mindset as a leader overall.
Yeah, no, it's, one of my favorite quotes ever is a quote by Nietzsche, which is convictions are a bigger enemy to the truth than a lie itself. And I really think that resonates across both the biology that HAYA is unlocking, as well as the operating model and how we think about building the organization and executing. So, just first of all, if I talk about the biology, The biology I'm describing now, up until relatively recently, was called junk DNA. Okay? There is an incredibly strong conviction, even today in academia as well as in industry, that biology and medicine is protein-centric. That 98% of the genome that does not encode for protein is evolutionary junk and doesn't have any causal roles in biology, development, evolution, and/or disease. That is a very, very strong conviction, and it's a very strong conviction, really anchored in the zeitgeist of when molecular biology really exploded. So the zeitgeist at the time was around machines and very mechanical, and thinking about molecular machines and proteins as the machines of life and the machines of disease. But actually, that conviction is somewhat misplaced, because biology, in particular the way biology and the genome responds to the environment, is highly adaptive, is highly plastic, has memory, has decision-making capabilities in terms of controlling cellular states and cellular identity. Is not mechanical at all. It's a feature and a property of emergent systems-level network activity. And that is a conviction that is very, very strong, both in academia and in this industry, which I think has had a negative impact in our way to truly unlock and translate new approaches in common and chronic disease. So the whole company is built off a scientific thesis, a therapeutic thesis, that goes against most of the convictions of molecular biology and the central dogma. You know, the central dogma, DNA makes RNA makes protein. It's very protein DNA centric, when actually we believe we put RNA at the center in terms of both directions of causality. So that's a very, very different kind of way of thinking. And I think the same applies in terms of our operating model. And when we ask a very simple question, how do complex systems, what are the best, most adapted, most evolved complex systems in the world that have succeeded? It's biological systems. Okay? And biological systems are inherently anti-fragile. We often focus, I think everybody agrees, biology is not necessarily that fragile. It's quite resilient, it's robust, but actually, I think biology, and especially more complex organisms, are not just resilient, they're highly anti-fragile. So the environmental stresses and disorder make the organism stronger, okay? And this is through the regulatory genome, actually. So at the most fundamental level, if you kind of go down those layers of causality and ask, where are the anti-fragile properties and principles of biology in a way hardwired, or where did they emerge from? It's the 98% of your genome that is the information processing layer. So we've learned a lot about principles, properties, and features of the anti-fragility of biology at the genomic level, and then we try to apply that in our operating model. How do we take ambiguity, uncertainty, failure, disorder, chaos, which we're constantly facing as a very early stage innovative biotech company trying to really translate a first in biology therapeutic thesis? How do we take all of that, convert it into information, and make us stronger as a result? And we care a lot about that, and we do a lot of work internally in terms of leveraging some of these principles of anti-fragility into our operating model, into our business development strategy, into our corporate strategy. And this is what I think is the power of biology. You can use it and learn from it in many, many different domains, not just in the concept of biology or evolution.
So you are literally justifying the phrase, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. It is constantly forcing the biology and your organization to be better over and over again.
Absolutely, constantly iterating. Take all of the challenges and use them as information to grow from.
Absolutely. How are you thinking about that piece of your organization relative to corporate culture? So 60 people in the organization, growth ambitions, lots of things in the future coming up for HAYA. How do you balance this constant chaos, pressure makes you stronger, push, 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 with the cultural elements of psychological safety, people feeling like they have a career path, that they can continue to progress and build something really meaningful with the organization?
Absolutely. So I think on the cultural side, at HAYA, we talk internally we describe ourselves as a tribe, okay? And a tribe is very different to, let's say, a family, but it's equally powerful, it's equally collective, but in a different type of way. And, when we talk about that, we talk about how tribes literally change the world, okay? How tribes of humans were able to leave Africa and, look what that's led to. And tribes essentially have the tools, the technologies, which they develop and they use, which for us is our science. But the most important thing that brings success to any tribe, we believe, is not necessarily the tools or the technology, which is the science, it's the culture. So we actually believe that the cultural operating model of HAYA is going to be responsible for 90 to 95% of any success we may achieve in the future. And we have a lot of cultural, we like to not call them values, we think of them more as virtues, because, virtues is really more about how you act versus what you say you're going to do. So right. We care a lot about how we holistically behave collectively and individually as a team, how we empower and how we really represent and action the virtues that we care about. And from a leadership or a kind of a cultural synthesis perspective, I think for me it's very, very clear, which is when you have a group of exceptionally talented, passionate, be that scientists, be that operators, be that drug developers, clinical developers, translational scientists, the scientific opportunity and the vision and the clinical impact that we can create with this is a huge motivation. It's a huge incentive, okay? Above and beyond anything else, all the perks that might come in a biotech. But how do you maximize their ability to deliver on that? Well, there needs to be incredible amount of context over control, actually. And, we are split between two geographies, Lausanne, Switzerland, San Diego. The team is basically split in half, but it's highly cross-functional. So within different functions and departments, individual contributors are spread across both sites. So it enforces cross-functional interaction. It forces leadership, management to be obsessed with setting context and not trying to control. So really distributed systems of understanding context and making decisions in an autonomous way. Again, principles of an anti-fragile system, lots of redundancy, lots of distribution, lots of rapid distributed decision-making that isn't, let's say, concentrated in a top-down manner, okay? And that links to the other key feature of our culture, which is being, highly aligned but loosely coupled. So aligned on the North Star, aligned on the vision, aligned on the context, but loosely coupled. Again, distributed with the ability to rapidly make decisions, rapidly iterate. And again, in an anti-fragile system, when you're making decision-making, you're always asking yourself the question about the symmetry or the asymmetry in the decision. What is the upside relative to the downside? And depending on those decisions, as you go throughout the organization, there's many, many decisions where the upside and the downside kind of calculation is very obvious to the people close to the decision-making process. They make that decision. So these are some of the principles of the culture, which I think allow us to operate in a distributed manner, but yet in a very, very integrated and cohesive manner, which is central. We always say there's only one HAYA culture, and that translates across geographies and across teams.
That's such a critical point, and I really appreciate how you described how your teams interact. Clearly, you have a high level of trust and respect in the team. So to get to a point where you can be distributed, you can trust people to make the right decisions at the right levels, there has to be this foundation of respect and trust across the entire enterprise. That it sounds like it's native to how you designed the organization from day one. And that changes the nature of what that pressure is that causes the stronger outcome in that anti-fragile system, right? So the concept of constantly pressuring is not pressuring as in I'm fearful. It's actually a safer system because I expect I'm going to bring an idea. I expect I'm going to get pushback, but we're going to constantly have pushback to make it better. and we're going to constantly evolve, make things better, make the organization better, make the assets better, and hopefully the result is the best possible result that you can get.
I think you've articulated it better than I did, which is because organizationally we all understand that we're operating in an anti-fragile way, we start to value pressure, stresses, uncertainty as information to grow.
Right.
It's this concept of post-traumatic growth. Those stresses are central to everything we do. And of course, we're at early stage, clinical stage, but still relatively small early stage biotech. And, from the outside, you could say there's a lot of chaos. There's a lot going on. We are using the pressure on time, on resource, on uncertainty around the biology, uncertainty around market conditions. We're using that information to iterate recursively and make better decisions and go faster. And so for us, we embrace that disorder because we think it's the substrate to allow us to execute better, to increase the probability of success, and to be more productive and more effective. So we embrace that. That's the culture we try to operate on.
It's so critical. When you and I first talked about these concepts, the immediate reference that came to mind was the structure of scientific revolutions, Thomas Kuhn's early philosophy of where science comes from, which is to question everything at its core and to assume that we don't actually know anything as a true fact, and we're going to constantly need to prove it. And it sounds like you've created an organization and a culture that is designed on that same core principle. You're going to constantly pressure. And with that, I think I would even question then when we talk about pressure and stress, we talk about it as a negative, as a foundation, but it doesn't have to be. And it actually, from your description, it's not only a positive, it's a competitive advantage, it's a differentiating factor, and it makes the organization much more resilient long-term. And that translates into hopefully the assets that you're able to develop, the team you're able to cultivate, and really the work you're able to establish in the organization.
Absolutely. That's how we think about pressure and stress and disorder. And again, it anchors to that theme, and in some ways, I would say that might differentiate HAYA from some of, let's say, the emerging companies especially in the world of AI and the AI drug discovery space, which, I feel like, and that's where humility is required. I feel like we think we can brute force engineer our way around biology. Whereas we take a very respectful view of biology. We're going to lean into the biology. Biology has been under selective pressures and has evolved complex systems to adapt and respond to the environment over millions and millions of years. And our job at HAYA, both in terms of drug discovery, drug development, and translation, as well as an operating model, it's not to fight against the biology or think we can engineer our way around it. It's to lean in and essentially dance with the biology. Speak the language of the biology and use those insights to allow the biology to respond in a way that is going to have a bigger and better impact for patients, rather than try to brute force it with an engineering approach.
Absolutely. I think it's such a beautiful and elegant way of thinking about building an organization and assets and drug development more broadly. As we've had this conversation, we started on this idea of being a scientific founder and what really led you to the point where now you're an effective organizational leader independent of your academic career and background. But it does make a lot of sense when you pull the threads in terms of what your focus has been, how you're thinking very differently about what drug discovery looks like, how you're setting the tone and setting the vision and creating a culture where people feel comfortable questioning and pushing the needle and constantly trying to be better and do something different that is outside of that zeitgeist and expectation of what drug discovery should look like, quote unquote, in our industry. So it's amazing. I'm very excited to see how your programs continue to evolve and very grateful for you making the time to join today, Samir.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. I really enjoyed the discussion, Kim.
Same here. Thanks.
Thanks for tuning in to the Emerging Biotech Leader, an SSI strategy podcast. Join us each month for more conversations with biotech leaders. If you'd like to help navigating the complexities of biotech, reach out to our team at ssistrategy.com. Don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a review.